I've run through this talk many, many times, and trying to get into the 40 minutes is a challenge. So like many of the speakers, I'm going to talk very quickly, and I'm not even going to bother introducing myself beyond I'm Ryan. So despite our best intentions, we've been amassing more and more JavaScript as we progress through the years building for the web. The HTTP archive shows that it's been growing roughly about 10% year on year. And if you go back an entire decade, you'll see that we've almost 4 times the amount that we're serving to mobiles and almost 3 times the amount that we serve to desktops. Now, to me, this begs the question, really, what are we doing with all of this JavaScript? Is the web so different than it was 10 years ago that it necessitates the sheer weight of this? But I'm often met with the question, well, why is that such a problem? Why is it such a big deal? Devices get faster, etc. But ultimately, it is a drag on our productivity, not just on web performance. Now, I couldn't talk about JavaScript this year in particular without covering interaction to next paint. So I'm aware we've got a very diverse crowd in, which is great. So just to cover off what that is, so we have 3 core web vitals. These are metrics that we use to measure web performance as close to like the real user experience as humanly possible. Obviously, we are dealing with numbers rather than a human being sat in front of us, so it is somewhat limited. But we've been iterating on the different metrics that we use for years, and these are the kind of current 3 that we place most value in. So. Interaction to next paint replaced a metric called first input delay as an official metric back in March this year. You might have heard some of the buzz around, Google starting to use it for SEO and whatnot. And if you look at this diagram, you'll see this is what first input delay was originally measuring. It's just this tiny little piece of the puzzle. And it was actually the first input on a given page. Now, of course, you might be typing many different times. Tejas was demoing, AI and chatting. Obviously, every key press he was typing into those chat windows, those are inputs. So this is more important than ever. And first input delay literally only took the first one. So pretty much every site on the web passed this kind of good threshold. Everyone thought everything was wonderful. But now we've got INP, and what INP does is it measures every interaction with a slight asterisk, but I won't go into the technical details of that right now. But basically every single interaction you have, and it measures a far wider spectrum of things. So everything from the input delay, which is the time between you typing something, clicking or tapping, and the JavaScript that hangs off that event actually starting to process. Then there's the processing time of that JavaScript. So, if you've got some DOM events, for example, you're listening on that click and triggering something that might happen, all of that processing. And then should you change the DOM, you open and close something, the browser's going to have to recalculate how CSS is applied. So it'll need to do that. That could be quite complex depending on how big your application is. And then it's got to ultimately paint something to the actual window so that people can actually see that something has changed. So that's the entirety of what INP measures. So how are we faring? Well, the useful thing is that whilst INP was only introduced as an official metric in 2024, we have data going all the way back to 2022 when it was first introduced by Chrome. And the great thing is, this chart's not great because it only goes to 80%, so it paints a far rosier picture than in reality. But 70-odd% of all websites do kind of pass Google's good threshold for this. But you can see, depending on the technology that you use, the pass rate might vary. And that's where there's a few problems with where we stand on this. If some of the frameworks out there are passing for just 40% of the sites that use them, which isn't an enormous figure by a long stretch. You're missing out on a significant portion of the web. But also, the metrics are measured at the 75th percentile. So that means we're ignoring 25% of the worst user interactions. That's a huge figure. Now, if anyone's been building websites for a while, you'll know that you care about things like browser compatibility, and most companies will aim for maybe anything down to a couple of percent, or even if you're building like government services, you need to go down to fractions of percentages that you care about. Ignoring 25% is a pretty big deal. And then on top of that, the threshold for good is 200 milliseconds, which sounds pretty fast, 20% of a second, but it's in the grand scheme of things, it's just about displaying something back to the user that input has actually occurred. So you're not locking that page up. So it's not really a tight milestone, really. Going back to the 60s, we've kind of generally regarded 100 milliseconds as the time for something to be perceived as instant. So for me, I'm starting to feel like we should be tightening up this metric. Speakerve did a blog post just before Christmas where they outlined that they've seen some of their clients see conversion drop-offs after just 100 milliseconds as well. So that suggests that for some different websites, it's worthwhile tracking and correlating that because ultimately 200 milliseconds may not be good enough for you. And then only last month, there was a somewhat heated debate on Twitter, as often occurs, where John Carmack of ID Software was proposing that people don't even wait for a full kind of click handler, where you've obviously got to go mouse down and then release that, or the same for obviously on mobiles. He's saying, no, you should just action on as soon as someone touches something, start actioning it, because he wants to remove tens of milliseconds and believes that all UIs should do that, which is obviously a very extreme view, but we're talking tens of milliseconds here, not 200, just tens. So obviously, that's a kind of somewhat kind of doom and gloom view of things. If we go back to the HTTP archive, you can see that we are generally trending things in a positive direction. And you can see that, particularly over the kind of past 6 months, things have started to accelerate. But a lot of this has been down to the fact that Google introduced an API called the LOAF API, or it's spelled kind of loaf, but they hate calling it that. And what that does is it tells you where these slow interactions are happening and attributes them to different events or different scripts. So obviously there's a lot of third parties in the world where you've dropped a script on a site to implement some functionality that you don't want to build in entirety yourself, putting that on your site, and then suddenly it's, caused problems for JavaScript. Now, obviously with that, those scripts get deployed on many, many websites, and therefore when IMPs come out and LOAFs come out, we can now see that those are problematic, and when they make changes, it impacts a vast swathe of the internet. So a lot of this benefit has come from, a handful of third parties who've actually improved things rather than the frameworks and libraries behind the scenes. So today I'm going to talk to you about how our kind of priorities have got a little misaligned over the past decade. How have we come to choose technologies that aren't really delivering for our users or ourselves? What it really means for us to be productive, and how we can work with the web platform to give our users a better experience and be more productive ourselves. It's my goal ultimately to convince you that you should be looking for solutions in the web platform natively rather than just jumping straight into JavaScript, looking at NPM packages and whatnot to implement anything that you might want to. So I think it's important to kind of look at where we've come from. Michelle talked a little bit about the history of where we came from in CSS layout, and I can expand on that a little further here. I've been working in web development for about 20 years now, so I'm at the point where most industry polls, things like State of HTML, do not care to bucket my tenure in the industry beyond just some kind of open-ended category of how old I am. And this literally happened last week in a survey from Google who wanted to speak to me, where I had to pick that open-ended category as well. So I know it's a bit weird to bring up my age, but it shows that I've been through multiple kind of eras on the web. So when I first started, we were doing silly things like this. So we weren't debating whether CSS belongs in our JavaScript. We were putting JavaScript in our CSS. For anyone who's looking a bit puzzled, what this used to do is in early versions of Internet Explorer, PNG files didn't have, there was no native support for kind of alpha transparency. This script enabled it by running some sort of VB script back in the day. Obviously, it was terrible for performance because you're basically running a script for every single image on the page. Awful. But, there was a whole bunch of different things back then as well. So we didn't have evergreen browsers like we do today, where they just naturally update independent of your operating system. So you were kind of waiting, if IE7 came out, you had to wait for people to update Windows. So you might be able to see these new features, but not actually be able to use them. And adoption happened at a snail's pace. Front-end development wasn't really taken as seriously, certainly not as today. We had web designers who were kind of mostly focused on the kind of design side and may have come from graphic design, and they might know a bit of HTML and CSS. And then you had kind of the web developers who do with all the back-end stuff, and they might kind of lean into the kind of front-end piece as well. So there's kind of like a bit in the middle where they met, but no one was really like employed just to handle JavaScript effectively. Half the web was inaccessible Flash. It was owned by Macromedia back in the day before Adobe bought it. Thank God that's gone. And while Selenium did exist, obviously that was one of the early tools for doing browser testing, no one really used it. Most people just kind of YOLO'd some jQuery code and hit refresh in their browser to check things that were working. And finally, our web performance tooling was rudimentary. We didn't have Google Lighthouse. We didn't have web page test. So trying to figure out where we really stood with that was quite challenging. But there were some absolutely fantastic things. Obviously, like the web is like the best way to reach a global audience. Even today, we have this. Like if anyone's tried native mobile development, the gap between you finishing something and getting that in the hands of your actual users is enormous. There's nothing like building for the web where you can hit deploy and 30 seconds later, real people are using your products. So this is fantastic. So you can iterate faster than on anything else. Back then, we also had lower disparity in our connectivity and our compute power as well. Most people were sat on dial-up or early broadband, so you really kind of experienced how your users felt when they were browsing your websites and web applications. It wasn't a case of everyone having nowadays, well, everyone here maybe, having a supercomputer in their pocket, but then some people being on 10-year-old Android phones, the battery's wrecked, etc. And you don't have that same experience. Progressive enhancement and graceful degradation were two terms that were coined to help introduce kind of robustness into how we build for the web because of these kind of very flaky conditions, to try and push things forward and give a better user experience. And the web standards movement made headway on trying to create consistency between the browsers, give us APIs that we can rely on across them. So despite all this progress, the past decades felt a little like this. This is why I named the talk, literally just to get one meme slide in. So we've seen incredible growth in our industry, right? Front-end development is now taken very seriously. It's an independent role. We're even getting like front-end development as like a title. But we've been presented with a whole bunch of very kind of shiny but shallow demos from big tech and VC-funded startups that ultimately, might work great in a kind of hello world example, but then we get burnt by further down the line. And it's partially because we've had this kind of pressure on available talent. We've had the desire to kind of move fast and break things. So we've been kind of over-prioritizing hiring and retaining staff and kind of losing sight of our end users. And I know that the whole kind of job market thing has changed recently, quite starkly, but the impact of the past decade in terms of how we build has very much persisted. So last year, someone, not me, polled Reddit for why are you still using React in 2023? The description went on to say there's better options and whatnot, but ultimately the top voted answer was basically the money. And I'm not hating on React here, and I'm not hating on anyone just trying to earn a living. Obviously, that's incredibly important, but this is a far cry from being user-centric. The promise has always been that if we focus on developer experience, we'll actually get a trickle-down effect and our users will get a better experience because you'll have more time to optimize things and you'll be outsourcing a degree of that expertise to the people who maintain these large frameworks and libraries that we might use. Of course, if this supposed trickle-down effect was actually, had actually worked, then websites and web applications would be utterly incredible right now. But I don't know about you, but I don't really feel that they are. The prevailing majority of businesses believe that their own website has such bad user experience that it's costing them sales. Actually, 10% of these believe it's over £100,000 of lost revenue each year. When this dropped in my inbox, this did not surprise me at all because ultimately the web is often broken in very profound ways. Even on like a shiny new MacBook Pro and gigabit fiber, I've collected an entire folder of screenshots and screen recordings of just major brands where their websites don't function properly. And I've got some examples, but I'm not going to share any names. We've got things like, janky sliders where they're like 2 frames a second and they've not locked the scroll direction properly. So the whole page is going up and down as you're trying to go left and right. We've got slow skeleton loading screens where you're thinking, hang on, this is like static content. Why am I looking at a loading state? And we've got mega menus that, you're trying to like hover over something, but it disappears before you can get there. Here's one example that I had recently, trying to check into a flight, and it was using JavaScript to load the check-in form. Now, this is 3 fields. It's the same for everyone. I think it's like last name and booking reference and maybe what day you're flying or something like that. There's no need for this to happen. But there was an error in their JavaScript and it meant that I couldn't check in. Luckily, it resolved itself after a while. But and then ironically, on the way back, there was a similar problem where the form actually rendered, but the tool that collects their JavaScript errors, the actual JavaScript library, had a bug in it, so you couldn't submit the form, but they wouldn't know that because the tool that collects those errors wasn't working. So they must have been thinking they were having the best day of their lives, like, oh, no errors on the website, great, wonderful. And it's like, yeah, because none of them are being collected. So as an industry, I feel like we can do a lot better than this. The last thing I want, is everyone to perceive that mobile apps are the best way to do everything. And then you've got to build things 3 times. You've got to build for the web, Android, and iOS at the very minimum for everything that you work on. So what we need to do is recognize that a lot of the time we're not actually being sold on we're being sold on convenience, not productivity. And we need to recognize that and understand that convenience can be important, but it should only be prioritized when absolutely necessary. Like if you're abroad and you're there for a short period of time, you might want to use a local convenience supermarket to do your shopping. But if you're there for a longer period of time, then it's going to be probably more expensive, less healthy for you because you can have less access to fruit and veg than going to a larger out-of-town supermarket. Productivity is more than just how quickly can we install an NPM package or drop a third-party script on our sites, because there's always a knock-on effect by doing that. And performance is something that is a regular victim. I messaged my friend Harry Roberts, who's a web performance consultant, about this and said to him, look, how many of the brands that you work with, how many of them come to you up front because they're starting like a re-platform or something like that, and they want to get ahead of web performance. They want to make sure that they are going the right direction versus how many come to you when everything is on fire and they've got loads of problems. And somewhat expectedly, it's the latter. Everyone comes when there's a problem. And these are big brands that have been sold on, this will be more productive, costs will be lower, performance will be incredible, everything will be instant. And then they get burned later down the line where they've got to halt all progress. They can't work on product enhancements because they need to go and fix performance, for example. And it's because no one's taken the time to look at these projects holistically and think about what tools are best. And also analyze these wild claims that are being made. So I've run my own startup for the past 10 years or so. I've been acting CTO, sorry. Just gave myself an upgrade there. And now I've moved on to doing that as a consultancy. And it's my job to kind of balance the kind of various different elements of these projects, the functional and non-functional requirements, how the business operates, etc., to come up with solutions that are going to meet the needs. And it's these things collectively that make us productive and make us successful. And one thing I can tell you is that when there are performance problems, it's kind of like a code smell, but for like an organization or a project. You start peeling away and there's a million things under the hood that are all going wrong. And of course, we need to strike a balance between all of these things, but we should really be mainly focusing on the top 6 here. Now, I'm not innocent in this at all. A couple of years ago, one of my teams came to me and they wanted to use a new tech stack. Everyone was using React. Everyone wants to be the next Netflix, the next Twitter, the next whatever. And the trouble is that few people come up on stage and speak about when this goes horribly, horribly wrong. So that's partly what I'm going to do today. As I mentioned at the time, there was a kind of shortage of developers. Everyone wanted to focus on getting hired. And there was this kind of vicious circle of businesses prioritizing what developers wanted to work on rather than what was best for their users. And then we just kind of focused on this kind of retaining of talent thereafter. So ultimately, my team came to me and they'd suggested Next.js. And, given my background in web performance, I was naturally a little bit skeptical, but they assured me that any suggestion I might have, any change, they would be able to make it and it would all be fine. So ultimately, I accepted this decision on the basis that we did need to de-risk the availability of talent. And I want to be clear, it was far from chaos and an utter disaster. It was necessary at the time, but it was a very costly decision. As you can see from this screenshot, the team did incredible work on web performance, but every single little change, every optimization took way longer than anticipated. It was because their tools weren't working with the grain of web, but they were working against it. And these are senior engineers on very expensive salaries. They had my full support and my expertise, plus the prioritization of the business to work on this. I kid you not, the amount of times when we pushed for, loading state to be added because, in single page applications, there isn't one by default. And I did kind of alter the screenshot slightly just to kind of hide a little distraction there. But this was taken before IMP went official. And as you can see, when it went official, it was going to be back to square one in terms of passing those core web vitals. So even after all of that, we still had problems. And you can imagine how organizations will be faring when, they don't have top-down prioritization for performance. They don't have in-house expertise, or, they don't have the budget to focus on these things. In fact, I can actually demonstrate. So this is a couple of screenshots from SpeedCurve. This is a client of mine who was on a server-side rendered application, just using jQuery on the front end, so nothing fancy, but it worked. It could have been faster, could have been more modern, probably had a little bit of legacy in there, but it did work. And they were sold the dream of single-page apps and all this kind of instant performance. And as you can see, it's very small, but there's a lot of red on here. In fact, the only green is really metrics that we don't really care about anymore. Things like start render, which is, as soon as you show anything on the screen, it's like, okay, well, that's not really a good measure of performance. So this seems to be a recurring theme where people are pushed into these single-page apps by agencies and developers alike. They're sold this dream that things are going to be instant, but did anyone actually ask for this? Now, I'm that exciting that I actually read the customer feedback that's collected on some websites. The little boxes after you place an order. How did you fare with the website today or whatever? All exciting stuff. And I can tell you, there's going to be some weird stuff in there. But this is never one of them. No one ever says, "Oh yeah, your website's great, but actually it would be better as an app," because they just want to get on there, achieve what they need to, and leave. And the trouble is that obviously there's a lot of FOMO in the industry. We're told that if you don't have architecture diagrams that look like this, if you don't have 2,000 microservices that are unified by isometric GraphQL and rendering a componentized design system via serverless edge workers, that you'd kind of yesterday's news. But you look at what our actual users really want. All they want is a consistently working, reasonably fast, accessible, and usable website. So this is really where we should be prioritizing. So we should be focusing on the top 6 here. So I'm just going to rattle through the kind of problems that we get when we focus too much on client-side JavaScript and re-implement parts of the platform. So obviously, when it comes to performance, whether it's the impact of the network, client-side hydration, VDOM diffing, complex DOM updates, late discovery of nested resources, or things like missing GPU compositing, there's a plethora of problems. And yes, we do have tools. We have compression, we have tree shaking, we have bundling, we have resources, we have all these other things, but they're just tools. They're not silver bullets. They're not going to just solve all our performance problems, and there are other things that we have to maintain. These things all add to our build process, which makes things slower and then makes things more to maintain. Speaking of which, if you've ever opened a JavaScript-heavy project after 6 months, maybe it's a small part of your ecosystem, I can tell you, you're probably going to have to update a whole bunch of dependencies. There's going to be things that have been deprecated or even dropped entirely. There's going to be new versions of various libraries and frameworks. So you have to put in a serious amount of effort before you can even make any changes. Like Ian and Stephanie, I don't really need to get started on talking about people using divs instead of buttons and links. That problem can happen outside of large JavaScript use. It's a problem that dates back to the jQuery days. But you'll often find that people who work primarily with the web platform and focus on what it offers natively rely on the native behavior of those elements. So they need a button to act like a button. They need a link to act like a link, because then they're building on top of that behavior. Two of the most powerful tools we have for web security are content security policies and feature policies. Trouble with these is that they're loaded from the document on each navigation. So if you only have soft navigations where you're re-rendering the DOM, ultimately that means that you've got to broaden these policies to effectively allow anything that's anywhere on your website to load on any page, which obviously makes your security audits a little more tricky. If you've got to care about things like HIPAA or PCI compliance, that's going to be a lot harder. With each soft navigation, you also have to carefully plan for how that navigation works and how the user might refresh the page. Things like restoring the scroll position, or focusing as well. An immense amount of stress is inflicted on our users when the back button doesn't work properly. If you've ever seen someone try and browse like an e-commerce product listing page, and they're opening every single product in a new tab because they just can't trust that they can ever get back to where they were, then that's going to be kind of form of stress, I guess. And finally, we lose the ability for the browser to natively take care of breaking down that stale page state when we've navigated away from something. It's pretty much guaranteed that with a long enough session on just kind of one page, or effectively within a single page application style, people will run into either bad states or memory problems. We used to have a world where we collect these kind of problems on our servers in a nice consistent environment where we can bear the burden of shipping all that information off. And then now we've got to actually burden our end users with collecting all of that complexity in terms of the information for debugging as well. So ultimately, working formally, predominantly in the client side is a quick way to introduce kind of brittleness into your websites. And then finally here I've got onboarding and training, which every company is different, so I can't really say that this isn't necessarily a benefit or a pro or con or anything like that. Ultimately, even with things like Next.js, where you've got these frameworks, everyone's implementing things in very different ways. Everyone's got different libraries, so ultimately it's kind of much of a muchness regardless of what technology you're using there. You're always going to need onboarding and training. So I could go on, delve into these a whole load deeper, but ultimately I think it's pretty clear that few teams are actually equipped to deal with this degree of complexity. And even the ones that can, we should probably be questioning, should they be? Is it a good use of their time? Obviously I hope everyone here's an exception to that. You're here because you want to learn and do better and, empower your users and whatnot. So, if you are, then, this gets to the crux of my talk. We're only half an hour in. We should be embracing the web platform. So you may not be aware of this, but it's actually baked into how the platform is developed that changes should actually make our lives easier as developers, as well as the lives of our users. The W3C calls this their priorities of constituencies. So you've got people like Stephanie at Galia, working on things that make our lives easier. So it seems silly to me not to make the most of that and just kind of I'll just implement it all myself. And I can show you, the kind of before and after of focusing on, utilizing the web platform or not utilizing the web platform. So I've got a couple of projects, like case studies, I suppose, that I'll take you through. So this is a large e-commerce site. It's an online marketplace. This is the kind of before. So you can see along the top, we've got the different core web metrics that kind of somewhat match the core web vitals. One in the middle, this is before IMP was introduced, so this is total blocking time. And as you can see, it's kind of in the red-orange zone, so not great. And then these bright purple bars, that's time to interactive, which as you can see is kind of off the scale. It's at 12 seconds. This is a big single-page application. So obviously that was problematic, but it's not the only problem. There was 55,000 lines of JavaScript. I did take this out of GitHub, so it is the source rather than what is being served to users, but that's not going to compile down to nothing, is it? There's still going to be a lot there. And ultimately, that's something that we had to maintain. So something had to be done. And then I've got one other project for you. This is obviously since Interaction to Next Paint has gone official. This is a site that was a single page app as well. You can see here, it's in the kind of orange zone again, which needs improvement under kind of Google's rules. But to me, it's, look at the size of that red section. If we zoom in on that, you see that almost 20% of interactions were over 500 milliseconds. And bear in mind that at 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, that's when we start to context switch in our brains, and we're kind of, having to come back to this and, reevaluate where we were on the web page. We may not completely switch off and go and do something else, but it's, again, putting more strain on that user experience. So, with only 10 minutes left, I'm going to have to really rattle through this. So I wanted to take you through 5 of the APIs that we use on these projects to really improve our productivity, really improve our web performance, and show you kind of how it's never been better to build for the web right now. But before I go into those APIs, I should show you the kind of approach that we took first. So sorry about the tease there. So firstly, I mentioned progressive enhancement beforehand. Some people see this as some sort of tax, on how they develop, like it's going to slow them down. But ultimately, the productivity gain from implementing this means that, if you have a problem with some JavaScript somewhere, the site will still remain functional. So that means that any issue that would have been a P1 and drop everything and the whole company needs to get together and fix this suddenly is, a lot more calm. We can address that, maybe next sprint or something like that. So it has an immense impact on how you work. And a lot of people have kind of different opinions of really what it means. So I wanted to kind of just clarify what it means to me. So it means sending useful HTML. That means like, forms, links, buttons that actually do what they're supposed to. You need to accept that there will be bugs in your software. I don't know a single person, myself included, who have ever written a bug-free piece of software. I don't think that even exists. So, accepting that there will be bugs and preparing for that is a far better plan. It doesn't mean that you have to have every single feature working without JavaScript, regardless of importance. For example, you might have like a store finder on an e-commerce website, for example. That doesn't have to display the map for everyone. As long as they could get a list of maybe the nearby stores, that might be enough. The map might just be an enhancement. And it doesn't mean that you have to go cold turkey on frameworks and libraries, but it's about using them consciously. Secondly, browsers are moving exceptionally quickly these days. So you need to review more often than you might be used to in terms of what features you can use with your users. When Can I Use was first introduced in 2008, this was the pace of releases. Maybe you might get one update a year. Again, these were probably tied back to operating system updates as well, so it was even slower. But this is what it looks like now. We're literally getting pretty much once a month. Every browser is updating. So that means that as new features are coming in, they're adopted far more quickly. So again, we don't need to wait for every browser to support a feature before we can start using it. You might not want to depend on it always being there, but obviously coupled with progressive enhancement, you can provide a great experience. We don't need to wait for everyone to update their browser. It might be that just say Safari 18 has just come out, and there's a feature that I'll talk about in a second. The beta for that's just come out. So we know that that's going to be in the hands of half the web within maybe 6 months. So you can start to plan for that in terms of how you develop. We don't need to develop against the lowest common denominator. And ultimately, we should be looking at features that are going to benefit. If there's a native web platform feature that maybe is supported by 70% of browsers, and we've got a reasonable fallback for that, maybe we can polyfill and shim it or something like that. We can deliver that feature and start benefiting people today rather than just sending everyone down the loads of JavaScript routes. Which leads me neatly on to how we use polyfills. So obviously, if there's a platform native solution, that's probably going to be the most performant, probably the most accessible. Obviously, you've got to be kind of careful around that because sometimes they come out and they're not great. But we can often only have to fall back to something that's kind of reliant on JavaScript or a bit more heavy-handed for a small minority of people. And it might be as simple as just having an alternate code path like, if-else, effectively. So again, we don't necessarily need to make everything work for everyone regardless of performance impact. We don't want to target 100% of people and give 10% of them a really awful experience because of the performance, just to force it in. It'd be maybe better for them to have a more simplified experience, so that they still get great performance. We don't necessarily need to use polyfills that go back to like IE8 these days. You might only be targeting, modern browsers. So it's worthwhile checking like how much of their code is to support these older browsers. And we may not need to use the whole polyfill at all. Maybe that we're just using one small feature of an API, and we don't need this massive, like 100 kilobytes of JavaScript that patches every single part of it. It could just be, actually, we'll just do an if-else because it's just like one line to patch it in. And finally, we need to review when we have polyfills in play. Are we in a situation where they're no longer needed because browser support has moved on? So ultimately, we want to give the majority of our customer base, as many people as possible, a great experience. That doesn't mean the same experience, just a really great one. So I can now finally get into these features. So the first major kind of architectural decision was to use custom elements for the majority of functionality. Now, I've hesitated to say web components because when I say web components, people think Shadow DOM, and Shadow DOM sounds really scary, and then suddenly, they're just like, no, I'm not even going to go down this route. So let's just ignore that for the purpose of this talk. And there's some fairly advanced cases where you might need that, but it's great to just get started with basic custom elements today, and they're really well supported. So what am I talking about? It's basically just your own element. It has to have a hyphen in it. That's basically the only requirement. And you just wrap up some normal HTML. So you can use this on like containers and things like that. There's a very kind of React-style API for implementing the kind of JavaScript side of this, where you register your custom element and you can attach events to when it appears in the DOM and when it leaves the DOM. So if you want to attach any like click handlers, etc. You can observe any attribute changes. This is all just natively in the web. This has been there for years. And they can even now participate in forms as well, so validation and serialization as well. You can build components that just act like any other form element. This was just introduced in Safari 16.4 back in March. And then finally, you can style these as well. So there's a CSS selector for when they've been defined, but the JavaScript component is loaded in, and when they're not defined. So that way you can build on that in terms of progressive enhancement as well. So don't overcomplicate it. You may not need to use slots or the declarative shadow DOM. You can probably just get away with query selector in a HTML for a lot of things. You may not need isomorphic rendering. I know that some people don't want to have their toys taken away, and you're used to kind of writing JSX that can be executed on the server and sent that way, and on the client as well. But I've found that the majority of my components are basically just behavior, so they don't actually change the HTML to any significant degree. So, in that case, if there are the odd component, some duplication is probably fine. You might use like a snippet or partial or whatever your web framework might support. And there's a few web component libraries, Lit, WebC, and Enhance that can do this server side as well. Second feature, and this one's a nice visual one, where it's kind of like a two stones, two birds with one stone kind of scenario. So scroll snap has been supported just via CSS for years now. So we don't need to use any janky JavaScript libraries to do this. It's roughly about 10 lines of CSS. Don't worry about this. There's a link to the slides in the bottom corner for everyone who wants to kind of analyze this, but that's just to show how simple it is. The trouble is that this pattern kind of breaks down on desktop. So I wanted to introduce some more affordance. So we wanted these little shadows that appear left and right to indicate that you can swipe left and right. So to do that, that leads me neatly on to another feature, scroll linked animation. And there's another example here on the left where you can swipe between the images and the little indicator beneath is changing. Again, I mean, this is on its way to Safari, and I think Firefox has it behind a flag at the moment, but it's already in Chrome. Progressive enhancement, so you can always fall back. It might be that you want to use intersection observer or something like that. But the CSS version, literally again, about 10 lines of code there. You just kind of hook into these different elements. And you can enhance it in a really straightforward way. One of the great ways I've found to do progressive enhancement is to actually use media queries and CSS supports in JavaScript to detect whether I need to replace the kind of lack of CSS support in JavaScript. And again, we can use those custom components to do that. To give you another little visual example of what this can be used for, I've got this little e-commerce site, local wine merchant, and as you scroll down, you can see that we have a little kind of filtering bar that pins to the top and has a nice little shadow. So there's a whole bunch of use cases for that feature, and it's going to be really exciting to see how much JavaScript we can get rid of. View transitions, this is the second kind of visual feature and a really big one. So for me, just to have page transitions and kind of that app-like feel. Single page applications are a huge trade-off just to gain that. But I get that no one likes having their toys taken away. If you've already built a single page app, telling someone, oh no, we're going to go back to regular, like, you click and then the whole page goes white kind of thing. People aren't so happy with that. So there's two levels to this. This is the second level. Cross-document transitions. So this allows you, as you navigate, to animate between pages. So this is just a regular website, not a single page app, navigating between a product listing page and a product detail page, and obviously animating between. So you get that kind of app-like feel. Obviously, you could go way more into the animation than this does. This is just a small example. But you enable this literally with just 3 lines of CSS. It can be as simple as that. If you want to animate, choose which element to animate, you just give it a name, simple as that. And then you can enhance that and choose how the animation might happen using CSS keyframes, which has been in the web for a very long time. So here's another example of what that might look like in terms of like fading between the two. And then the other level of this is actually level 1 of the API. So this has got better support. I believe this is in the new Safari beta, and Firefox are working on this. So this is likely to be better supported first. Again, it's a progressive enhancement if you implement it right. So literally 1 line of JavaScript to do that. So document.start view transition, you give it a callback, a function that's going to run. Effectively what it's doing is taking a screenshot before, screenshot after, and animating the different elements around. Really straightforward. And obviously you can just call that callback immediately. If you don't have support for it, it'll just happen immediately. Oh, right. Sorry, I'm really running out of time. So if you really want to turbocharge your website, speculation rules is going to be something that is going to be the next big thing for you. So this is only in Chrome and Edge at the moment, but obviously there's a lot of discussion going on with the Safari and WebKit teams, Firefox and WebKit teams, as to when, to how to implement this and get support. There's been a bit of resistance, but ultimately something along these lines I truly believe will get implemented. We may need to tweak our implementation, but it's going to come at some point. And this is a perfect demonstration of the platform, or rather browsers, supporting us and looking after our users. So it's as simple as this. You have a block of JSON, you give it some URLs or like a matcher for URLs, so it'll look at all the links on the page, or you can even give it a CSS selector as well, and you tell it to either pre-render or prefetch those pages. So you get as close to instant performance as humanly possible. There's zero JavaScript involved. Literally, you can just inline that JSON or you can use a header. You get to use all your caching built into HTTP. It's exposed to your analytics so you can see how often this is being triggered. And it's completely managed by the browser. So they take care of things like memory pressure, battery status, and data saving. So they may not preload or pre-render if someone's trying to conserve those. So this is how fast it can be. This is me just clicking on a product detail page from a home page. You can see that it literally is instant. And you can see in Chrome, there's a section within DevTools that shows you that it works. There's a little green icon there. And you can actually combine this with view transition, so you don't just get that instant flip. You get this lovely kind of animation between the pages. This is just my video site. And as you can see, you get that instant experience as well as those transitions. And the final piece of the puzzle is the navigation API. So this has been in Chrome for years. It is coming in Firefox and Safari. It is being worked on, so it should be in there by the end of the year. So if you've been using the history API to modify URLs, you have got to manually attach all your event listeners, you've got to manually implement loading feedback, you've got to make sure you announce page changes, to assistive technology properly, and you've got to manage that scroll position all yourself. Whereas the navigation API, because it's built into the web platform, does this for you. And it's as simple as this. You literally just attach an event, choose whether you want to intercept it, load some content maybe, and then re-render. Simple as that. And this is a perfect place that you can put in those view transitions. So it's decoupled from the DOM. You get that native browser loading state, so the little bar going across or the little spinner will activate. So natively there's some feedback to your users. You don't have to worry about assistive technology because the browser will take care of announcing that. And in terms of the scroll position and focus handling as well, the browser will take care of all of that for you. So ultimately, use the web platform and don't re-implement it. So how are those stats looking? Well, so we had 55,000 lines of JavaScript on that project before, 650 afterwards. Some of that obviously was, taken by server-side rendering, but that's the kind of stark level of change we had. This is our metrics from beforehand. Again, 12 seconds. Unfortunately, the actual axis is going to change here. So this looks actually worse. But the scale is now to 3 seconds. So we've gone from 12 to 3 on time to interactive. And then this is IMP, the one that's just been introduced. This is what happens after moving away from a single page app. So just in closing, understand who your audience are. I can't encourage you enough to go on Amazon, find a used Android device from maybe 2018. There'll be about £70 or so if you can get the budget from your company. Buy one of those and just keep it on your desk and be testing things as you're developing, because using things like this there's a huge disconnect with many of our customers. Don't limit yourself to just fully adopted features, especially for things that we know are going to be introduced by other browsers. It's worth keeping track of what's coming. There's things like intent to ship, which is on like a bot on both Twitter and Mastodon that you can follow, and you'll see the browser vendors introducing betas and things like that of these new features. So you can think, oh, okay, I can't really necessarily depend on this now, but it's going to be coming in the next few months. So therefore, I'm going to implement for that, and then everyone gets that benefit. Consider obviously the standards that are out there. There's a lot of discussion online that you can really use to understand where things are heading, and obviously revisit all those polyfills. Look at do you need to polyfill literally the entire world or just a few APIs? And finally, I'll just leave you with this quote from Warren Buffett. Obviously, this was primarily about investing, but ultimately, you don't need to do extraordinary things. You don't need to have crazy tools to achieve extraordinary results. You just need to do the kind of ordinary, everyday stuff exceptionally well. So I think that embodies working with the platform. If you really understand it, then you will achieve extraordinary results. Thank you very much.